will be an interesting conversation on how to make your rubrics accessible to your students. My name is Mary Rotundo. I am an instructional designer at the Center for E-Learning. So today we are going to be using the meeting center in WebEx, and our moderator is Gabby. She will communicate with you. She's your personal concierge. She will let us know when you want to participate. I am your presenter. That I'm really hoping that we'll have interaction today. And of course, you are the stars of the session, our participants. So let us know when you want to be unmuted so you can speak and share. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. We're going to discuss ideas for using rubrics as a tool for student planning, and therefore the analogy with the gas meter and the full tank, half tank, and the empty tank, and I will explain what those mean to me later on. We are going to share ways to make rubrics accessible to our students, hopefully share what works for you in terms of how you understand your rubrics and how you would like to talk about them with your students. And then the second part of today's session will be about exploring strategies for effective use of rubrics in formative assessment and self-directed learning. So moving on. So like I said, we'll be talking today about how to use rubrics. Our session today is not on how to build rubrics or how to design rubrics. We have resources for that in our e-certification workshop. And if you need any help, you have any questions about how to build your rubric, please do contact any of us and we'll help you with that. But today's session is more on using these rubrics, and more than that, communicating what's in these rubrics to your students in a way that makes sense to them. So why do this? Why have this conversation and hopefully a dialogue about your rubrics? First is about transparency. The more your students understand where you're coming from, the less anxious they will be about what to do. There is nothing that they're not prepared for. There's early on communication and expectations that would allow them to do exactly what I would want them to do, which is to plan what they're going to do, and a dialogue on quality parameters from the onset. So it starts at the same time the assignment is given to them. These conversations starts at the same time. Let us know, Gabby, at any point if we have any questions, please do feel free to let us know. Okay? Alrighty, so using your rubrics as a tool for planning. And I'm going to explain why this is so relevant to me and why this makes sense to me. So I have a little bit of a commute every day. I usually drive about an hour to get to work. And it's about 40 miles. So gas and knowing how much gas I have to get to work is something that I'm always thinking about. A look at my gas meter tells me how many times I can get back and forth to work without stopping to get more gas. And this allows me to plan not only that, but depending on where I put gas is more or less expensive. So I can also make that decision just by looking at my gas meter. I can figure out, oh, I will be able to get gas tomorrow when I come home, and gas is usually less expensive there. The other thing it allows me to plan is if I'm pressed for time and I need to get to work, I don't want to be stopping to get gas. So there's a lot of information that I get from just taking a look at that simple gas meter. So I want to use this analogy today to start thinking about our rubrics for our students the same way the gas meter works for them. How far can our students get when they see your rubrics? How many decisions they will make on the spot? How will they plan their course of action? So that's why you will see these gas tank throughout the presentation. Any comments, questions? No? We're good? Alrighty, so the other idea is, which will come at the second part of the presentation, we want our students to be on the driver's seat. We want them to be engaged in setting up the course of what they're going to be doing. We want them to engage in all these decisions, and we want them to know how far they can. And we want them to know they have that choice. So when they read the rubric and the rubric speaks to them the same way the gas meter speaks to me, our students can start thinking about how to approach an assignment. So what does this assignment look for me? How does that relate to what my teacher is asking me to do, but how do I understand what I need to do? So do I understand the quality criteria? What is proficiency? What does it look like? How has my teacher explained those parameters to me? How about mastery? Is there something in there that I feel like I want to tackle? I want to get there. How far do I want to go? This is a decision that I personally believe is important for students to make from the beginning, or as they work on the assignment, knowing that there's always that choice of taking it to the next level. So they can definitely chart their own. So what is a half tank? What does it say? What does it say to me when I sit there and I look at my meter in the morning and I see that I have a half tank? This, to me, is my comfort. This is where I feel like, okay, I can get to work, I can get to and from work, and I can get it done without worrying about it. So to me, the half tank means efficient. I want to tell my students, you don't want to get your car with any less than half tank. Actually, it will give you everything you need. For me, this is the target. The target zone. This is where an assignment meets the mark. And then when you explain that to your students, you will need to let them know what you accept as evidence that they had hit that mark. What does it look like when they have got it just right? Any questions?
Yes, I was just going to make a comment.
Sure.
The half tank is also a target mark for me, but for me, I don't have quite as far as you to drive. But for me, seeing the tank on half a tank, it's I better make sure sometime in the next day or so I get to the gas station, because once it gets to, I'm a little on the naive side about how engines work, but in my mind, I get better gas mileage on the top half than I do on the bottom half. So I like to get it filled up as soon as it gets to the half.
But I think the important thing is that you're meeting the standard, but you still have way to go. But you have the choice. You have the choice. Maybe I don't need to get gas today. Maybe today I want to go do something else. I want to concentrate on another assignment. But you always have that choice.
Yeah.
And that to me, instead of seeing it, I see how much more gas I can add to the tank. But where I am right now, is perfect. Alrighty, my next is running on empty. And preparing for this presentation, I found out that running on empty, when your car says empty, you really have a little bit to go. And the reason for this is that the way the mechanics of this is that for the reader to read how much gas, there's a lever that sits within your tank. And it will tell you it's empty, but you will still have a few miles to get to the next gas station and maybe to your destination if you're not too far away. So running on empty, and this is why I have it there as a quarter tank, because even if your students do not completely meet the mark on that attempt, they always have the possibility of getting it at some point. So to me, there's always the value on that attempt and what they have produced. And the idea here is to concentrate on what they have given you. What is the value of where they are now? And reading the some of the research that I read for today's presentation, it is important that you convey that in your rubric. So your language is on the positive side, even though they didn't hit the mark completely. You want to be very careful about the language you use, so your students always feel that there is an opportunity for them to improve. This is the whole point of a rubric. So avoid language that sounds like this is it. Alrighty, then so concentrate on having your students think about the evidence of what is there, how they are getting closer to where the mark is instead of what it's not. You may indicate what's not there, but just be mindful of the language you will use for that. Alrighty, any comments on running on empty? Nope. Okay, so then we have our full tank. So what does it look like? If you're writing a rubric and you have all these levels of performance, let's say you're building an analytical rubric, you have pretty much defined what mastery looks like. There's another kind of rubric called the single point rubric that, before I go there, so when you write your mastery column on your rubric, you specify the evidence that you will accept to show that your students have gone above and beyond. They met the proficiency mark, but they gave you something else. And this something else can be their personal approach to the topic, new connections they made, details and the way they connected their argument. There's many ways your students go beyond. If you're using an analytical rubric, you have to provide those details about what it looks like to go above and beyond. There's another kind of rubric that I will briefly mention today. It's called the single point rubric. In the single point rubric, you don't have the below proficiency and above proficiency level. The rubric only gives you the proficiency level. So whoever is writing the rubric only has to write the criteria for that half-tank. And I wanted to bring an example of what that rubric looks like and explain what it would look like to me to go above and beyond. So the example this person uses is called breakfast in bed. And the person who created this example rubric is Jennifer Gonzalez. She runs a website called Cult of Pedagogy, and I found her example was beautiful. So as you can see, there is nothing about students not meeting the criteria, and there's nothing that specifies how they go above and beyond. So for something that just is on the spot, she talks about the food being cooked correctly, it being presented to you on a tray with maybe some flowers, and how the person creating the breakfast in bed experience also considered the comfort of the person receiving the breakfast. So how will that look to me? If, let's say, my boyfriend was preparing breakfast in bed for me because it's Mother's Day or my birthday or whatever. So the one way in which he would go above and beyond would be if I opened my eyes and I saw my two children standing there. So this is very personal. This is how I will feel that there's nothing else you can put on that experience of breakfast in bed. The food is okay, the food is wonderful, but the fact that he brought my children for that makes it really hit all of my expectations. Alrighty, so this is how I would communicate the idea of rubrics. This is how I would personally explain to my students I will use the analogy of the gas meter, and I will explain why it works for me and why I think it would work for them. Now, what I would like to do now is have you tell us about what metaphor will you use. I know Lisa there has a metaphor called shades of green, and she would explain that to us. And then we would love to hear from our other participants on, oh, maybe these other metaphor, these other analogy will work for me and why. Maybe bring some of the personal particulars that will make it work. All right, so
Mary Chantal has her hand raised. She would like to share something.
okay, absolutely.
Okay. Let me know when you can see my.
Go ahead, Lisa. We can see it. Your shades of green.
Yes. So I tend to think of the different proficiency levels in terms of a shade of green.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice that in the visual I have here, you have various shades of green in a horizontal line. And then underneath you have exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, not evident. And those stand for the typical proficiency levels that we may use in an analytical rubric, where we really break down those criteria that Mary was talking about. You notice that this goes along with what Mary was talking about, where proficient is like the spot. It's the bullseye. It's the mark. And so if we're creating a single point rubric, our proficiency level would be exactly what those criterion are that the students must hit, all students must hit no matter what. For me, that's why in my shade of green example, the proficient section is small, because it is what it is. They've met the mark. It's just this big. You notice that exemplary, on the other hand, is a brighter shade of green because, again, as Mary said, that's where students go above and beyond, and they bring in a little bit more of their own authenticity, and they make different connections maybe to the profession or maybe to other examples or other activities that you've exposed them to throughout your class. And that being said, it's wide because there are multiple ways, multiple variations that the students can go above and beyond, whereas proficient, again, is the center. We want everybody there. Proficiency is, wow, they have all of these different types of ways that they can show not only that they know, but they can excel. They've really made those insightful connections. Needs improvement, you see, is a lighter shade of green. It's still wide because, as we know, when students are not hitting the mark of proficient, there are the gaps in that learning. There are lots of ways that students can just hit the mark. So that, again, is a little wider, is wider than proficient, more so than exemplary, because a lot of times, in my mind, depending on that needs improvement section, it could be multiple gaps in the student's past that cause them to just miss that proficiency mark. And then when we use not evident, I'm not a big fan of that, using that term, but when we use not evident, it's just is what it is. The student did not show that they know and can do that criterion. So that's my shades of green example. Thank you for letting me share that, Mary.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, going back to our PowerPoint. So these are different ways in which, by making the rubric personal to you, you can have a better way of explaining it to your students. All right, so we checked these two metaphors, and now we're going to talk a little bit about using the rubrics not only as a tool for planning, but using your rubrics as a tool for learning. And the idea here is that both, whatever your students produce, as well as the rubric, contribute to their learning. So continuous learning, this process of constant improvement, the rubric can support this process within the framework of formative assessment or self-directed learning. And for the rest of the presentation, we're going to just share some strategies on using the rubrics for effective self-directed learning or formative assessment. So the whole point here is that students receive feedback and they use those results to continue on their learning process. And they will be doing so by comparing where they are against the goals of the assignment. And I wanted to stop here for a moment and talk about those goals. Many times it is the teacher that devises these goals. Formative assessment, however, gives the teacher an opportunity to review her own teaching, to revise these assessments so students can connect with these goals. In many cases, I read that in a face-to-face class, for example, when creating the rubric, you can actually have your students create their own learning. This may be a little bit more complicated to do in an online setting. You would have to have the time and space to do that. But even if that is not possible, the idea that students need to connect to these goals and make them their own is extremely important for self-directed learning. So to avoid that mismatch between your goals and the students' goals, you should find a way to make these shared goals, where the students relate to these goals and make them their own. So by talking to your students about the goals and about the rubric, you're clarifying what good performance is. By letting them know, okay, so this is my intense shade of green in the middle, or this is my half tank. You're letting your students know what good performance is so they can make it their own. They can decide, oh, this is where I want to go. They can then connect whatever feedback they're getting, either from their peers, either from the teacher herself or himself, or from their own assessment, they can connect that feedback with their performance and continue planning how to move ahead. So we were talking about formative assessment and how this also informs the faculty members' assessment practices so they can adapt what they're doing, and so that we have shared goals. So students feel that they have a saying in closing the performance gap. So they are empowered and informed on where they are so they can make the right decisions to move on and hit higher levels of performance. So our next interaction will be about, have you ever used your rubrics in formative assessments, and how? And what rubric strategies have you used to foster self-directed learning? So we would love to hear from you. And remember, if you cannot talk, you can still write on the chat. Let me know if we have anybody. Okay. Alrighty, so then I have examples on both rubrics for formative assessment or to encourage self-directed learning that I would love to share with you. So the first one is, this is always related to allowing your students, teaching your students, training your students to make objective judgments about the standards. And the standards, like we talked before, is something that they have been informed about and they have been given the opportunity to discuss with you. You explain them to them, and you also allowed for students to ask for clarification. So one way to do that is by having embedded processes of reflection as you're moving through an assignment. So students can identify by using the rubric, they can know where they are. They can know, oh, okay, so I'm here, I'm good. These are my strengths. Or they can identify what they still need to work on before they submit an assessment. If you're allowing for resubmission and they do that, they can then check, okay, so this is how much progress I have made, and decide their next steps. What do I want to concentrate on based on the feedback on the results that I already got? What are my next steps? You can also have your students make the choice of what shows proficiency. How can I showcase my achievements by creating a portfolio of my best work? And that is a very effective practice when your students, of course, are a little bit more proficient, to show that they understand what that proficiency is. So here we're giving them structured opportunities to monitor towards that full tank. Any questions, comments so far?
For Nancy.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I do use grading rubrics for my assessments. I use rubrics that provide a detailed description of what exemplary work on that category is, and what the standard is, and what is not evident is where they are missing the primary task at hand.
Beautiful.
And then Chantel said her question was answered. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Gabby. So I also have, thank you, Nancy, for that. And I'm going to go and move to exemplars, because I do have that as a strategy. So within this practice of teaching our students to make these objective judgments against the standard, there's nothing more effective than using work from other students. work that has been produced by their peers that showcases excellence in an assignment. So when you start with the exemplar, you can have a discussion and have your students reflect on the standards, or they can, starting from the actual exemplar, they can devise their own standards. So you give them the exemplar and they create the rubric on it. If this isn't possible because this is an online class and you may not be able to do that, you can still give them the standards and the exemplar and have a conversation with them in which you kind of negotiate these criteria, always making sure that they're clear and that this is something that your students feel compelled to attain. So that's, you can work backwards from the exemplar, creating the criteria, or you can use the criteria and the exemplar as a student to plan how you want to move forward. And the last strategy that I wanted to share with you is you can use your rubrics. Let me go back. Sorry about that. So we can use our rubrics to have students mark and comment and give meaningful feedback to their peers. And this is my absolute favorite practice because there's scaffolding here. By marking their peers, not only do students learn the skills, but students respond beautifully to their peers. Feedback that comes from their peers is to them something they take more seriously and they see as more authentic than anything coming from the teacher. So together with self-assessment, peer assessment is a way to actually allow for students to start working on that self-directed. So I'm gonna move ahead. We talked about the exemplars. And finally, the last strategy I wanted to share with you is, and Lisa and I talked about that, and Lisa, if you wanna share anything, please do so. We talked about using the rubric over time. So not using it for one assessment or not using it for a single time that your students try to work on an assessment, but allowing your students to work from the same rubric over a period of time. So they can use it to plan an assignment. So what is important for me and where do I want to put my effort? Do I want to concentrate on finding more resources for my research? Do I want to concentrate on polishing my language and editing? What is important to me at this point? Then, while they are engaged in producing work for you, check in with them, and have them submit an outline, a sketch, even a draft that shows where they are. Progress, work that is not completed, but work that can definitely get better. When you have a project like a capstone project, you can always have checkpoints and use the rubric to show your students the progression from one level or from one point to the assignment to the end. And always repeating the cycle, using the rubric and allowing resubmissions. I am a big fan of resubmissions. It's probably because I am a non-native, and also I taught writing for non-natives, and it was always important to me to give students the opportunity to go back to what they had written and edit their language, read the vocabulary, maybe see where there were gaps in their arguments. So I learned the value of research. So Lisa, is there anything you would like to add about the idea of using rubrics over time?
Yeah, I actually, thanks for asking. I can give you a very, very specific, concrete example with a class that I'm currently teaching. Now, what I'm going to explain to you, please know that I've used this format for my online class, and for my traditional face-to-face class. This is at the graduate level, but I've also used a similar format for my undergraduates as well, and I want to just mention that before I end. So the same rubric being used over and over again is, first of all, so that we don't run our own tank on empty. Because we have lots of work and we don't need to be creating things that we just don't need to be creating. So I have a final summative assessment that my graduate students create, and it's a combination of a few different pieces that they end up putting together in sort of a portfolio with a couple of commentaries and examples. This is for an education assessment class, okay? We start off in the very beginning of the class talking about milestones, and those are the formative, and we use the same rubric, the exact same rubric throughout. I do make one change, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the rubric that they use from day one is the same one they use at the end of the course when we check out that final summative. And so we engage in discussions and activities, and then they have their first milestone 2 or 3 weeks into the course. That milestone is a chunk, again, of that final summative, one part of it, and they're going to use that rubric. And they've already been looking at the rubric, and I always refer back to the rubric every chance I get to get them to go in there and look at it, okay? Mm-hmm. So they're in there. We score the rubric. We score that first milestone using the rubric. They take the feedback that I give them, and I use an analytical rubric, so it's very targeted on which criterion I give them feedback on, right? It helps them focus. When you talk about self-directed learning, that's key, right? Mm-hmm. And then they have a couple of more activities in the coming weeks. They have another milestone formative assignment that's due. Again, the same rubric, okay? And the expectation is now that they are using that feedback from earlier on, okay? They get more feedback now because they have additional work that they've added on to that first assignment, right? And here's the game changer. When we have our first, then I break it to a first part of the summative. Right. And this is where I add the exemplary. Because in the beginning of the first 2 milestones, I only want them to hit the target. Right. But I give them that feedback, right? And they're hitting the target, and that's great. And if they're not hitting the target, I give them the feedback so they get to the target. When we're close to that summative, because it's broken down to 2 parts, that's where I add the exemplary. Yeah. Because by then, they should already have their proficiency level all set. Now, it's the same rubric. I just show them, oh, here's the exemplary column. Okay, and then they get feedback from that first hit to the summative. They have time to apply it, more feedback, and then they're ready by the end. It's a cumulative now. It's the same rubric, right? They've had tons of feedback from me, from their peers. They've been self-directed, and they're ready to go. And here's the other piece. That self-assessment you're talking about, Mary, I have that as one of my critical elements. Every time they submit their formative feedback, their rubric back with their example, whether it's a milestone or a summative, they're always submitting a real short, real quick blurb self-assessment. Mm-hmm. How did they do? How did they think they did hitting those objectives? And those very specific, and I refer to them back to the rubric and their engagement in the discussion boards. How do you think you did now? And they submit that in addition to whatever milestone piece they're submitting or summative. And I score that self-assessment as part of the whole rubric, because that's key, as you said, Mary, right? That's part of adult learning. That's part of self-directed learning. And it really does help the student to gauge where they're at and where they still need to go.
And by providing that evidence to you in their self-reflection, I feel that not only do they make it their own, but by looking for that evidence, they understand the assessment even better.
Agreed.
Like a different level, a higher level of understanding, because you're looking for evidence of where you met the standard or where you produced outstanding work.
Exactly.
Yes.
And one other thing, you talked about the discussions with the criterion. You can literally just take one criteria from your critical element, from your rubric,
Yes.
put that in the discussion, a little bit of a student example, and have them just focus on that. And that can be something that you do that's informed by where they're at. So if they're missing the mark on one critical element, one criterion rather, pull that, put it in the discussion board, give them an example, an anonymous example, obviously, maybe it's something you create, and tell them to analyze it. What's good about it? Where are the limitations, right? And and then you're getting a hit in the DB.
I think that one of the problems is that students move from one assessment to the other without having the opportunity to have that pause and reflection. So maybe if we don't discuss the whole thing, like you're saying, there may be aspects that are really illuminating and you're having that opportunity. You can just put it on the discussion board, like you're saying, Lisa. That's a great idea.
Get down.
So I would say from my own experience, if the writing entails a completely different process, you can use a different rubric, but most likely they will be engaged in the same kind of project, like Lisa was saying. So it makes sense to use that progressive approach.
Make it
So
general.
yeah, exactly.
General.
Exactly. When I was teaching writing, we were concentrating on the differences between argumentative or compare and contrast or writing narration. So in that case, each kind of writing will have their own parameters. So it makes sense to think you could have somehow a different rubric. But for other kinds of essays, I think it makes sense to use the orderly progression through my milestones with the same rubric. Judy, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to say I really like that approach, and I was going to see if perhaps Lisa could share with us that we could send out to everyone after this later on today some sort of a generic form of that progressive that summative type of a rubric. That would be extremely helpful to me.
Yeah,
and
I mean, I certainly can. Yeah. Oh, yes, I do. I have templates that I can share. And, it's really key, right? Where you don't have to work yourself into a frenzy over rubrics. Make them general. And you could say something like, that the student, if it's a certain writing process, make it generalized so that it's almost like a fill in the blank, that the students are engaging in this type of writing, hitting this topic, but again, make it general, make it open-ended, so that you can use it over and over again, and they become familiar with it, and they understand what those super important components are in terms of writing or in terms of any mathematical process that you want them to go through.
Yeah.
Right. I would look for the similarities in all of the processes that you have them experience, whether they're writing, scientific, mathematical, whatever the subject matter, and I would just go from there. And don't make it any more difficult or any more time consuming than it needs to be. Rubrics are supposed to make our lives easier as teachers and as students. They're not supposed to drive us into a frenzy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And make it easier for the student success too, because bottom line, that's what we all are looking for. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa, for sharing from your vast resources of experience and expertise. And thank you, Mary, for all of the work and effort that went into creating this. We have coming up a couple of library sessions coming up, and we have a session on differentiation and how to break it down in order to reach our students. Seems to kind of link right into this too. So Thank you all for joining us, and we will send this information out later on today. Thanks so much. We appreciate that. Oh, yes, there's the video.
I wanted to wrap it up with a video that I created for you, so I invite you to watch it, and then we may have a couple more minutes for questions and final remarks. So let's, I'm gonna play the video here, and you guys can play it your own on your own computers.
And that's partly because we won't be able to hear from the screen, but we can see it. It's delightful.
Alrighty, so couple minutes for any final remarks. We will be sharing all of the references I used for creating today's presentation. Again, if you need help, assistance in creating your rubrics, please contact any of us, and Lisa will be sharing her templates and her examples too. Any final questions, Gabby? Anything? No? All right. I thank you so much, Lisa, Judy, and our participants for joining us today in our session. And we'll see you next week.
And thanks to all of you. We truly appreciate your input.
Absolutely. Thank you.